The early winter wind swept through the towering windows of the mansion, hidden away in the suburbs of Charleston, carrying with it a chill that seeped into every crevice of the aging wooden beams. Silver-gray silk curtains swayed gently, like patient ghosts waiting for a whisper. The sun sank behind the ancient oak trees, leaving the last glimmer of daylight, brushing lightly against the layers of dust that coated the elegant furnishings untouched for far too long. This place was once a home, but now it was a silent shrine to memory. Evan Caldwell stood motionless in the marble-tiled hallway, his gray-blue eyes quietly fixed on the portrait, hanging at the center of the living room. The painting captured his late wife, Evelyn, in the bloom of her youth, when her smile had been the only light he needed. That portrait had hung there for 20 years. 20 years without a single hand laid upon it. No one dusted it, as if the film of time could somehow soften the ache of longing. Evan strolled towards the fireplace and sank into the black velvet armchair she had once chosen. Besides, it was an unfinished book. Its final chapter was never read. Since Evelyn's sudden passing in a car accident, he had closed the doors of his heart, and with them, the doors of the home that had once echoed with laughter music and the smell of freshly baked pastries every Sunday morning. The women who had come to help in the years after never lasted more than a few weeks. They couldn't stand the cold, not of the weather, but of the sorrow that cloaked every corner of the house. Evan had never asked anyone to stay. He didn't want anyone to disturb the silence. From the kitchen, the grandfather clock ticked faintly, and in the stillness, an old voice echoed in his mind. "Never let the house grow quieter than your heart, Evan." Evelyn had said that once, when they were young, they were still full of dreams of winter spent together. He closed his eyes, but quiet brought no peace. It was merely a mask for weariness. The mansion's front door gave a faint creak, distant like a sigh from the past. His private butler James entered as cautiously as ever. Sir James said softly, "I've found a new housekeeper, an older woman, very experienced, rather quiet. I thought she might suit the place." Evan didn't open his eyes. Only the faintest nod signaled he had heard. It seemed he didn't care. Or perhaps he had grown used to things arriving and leaving, like late autumn leaves falling without farewell. He didn't know that this woman, with her slender figure skin, the warm hue of wood, and a smile gentler than morning light, was about to step into his life and quietly shift the silence he had thought eternal. Not like a storm, but with the quiet presence of early morning mist. And sometimes the gentlest touch awakens a heart long thought dead. If you've ever believed that love could return unexpectedly, even when it feels too late, leave a comment to share your thoughts, or follow the channel to continue the emotional journey with Mr. Evan and the remarkable woman who's about to change everything. Because sometimes the thing that moves us most comes from a smile no one ever saw coming. The first morning of December settled over Charleston with a thin veil of mist casting the sky in hues of silvery gray like an old silk ribbon suspended in mid-air. The heavy old bus pulled away from the station, leaving behind a trail of white exhaust and the silhouette of a woman strolling along the stone-paved path leading up to the mansion on the hill. Mrs. Lila Washington paused before the iron gate, pulling up the collar of her gray coat to shield her neck from the biting wind. A worn brown leather bag in her hand, its strap frayed but cared for as though it held an entire life inside. Her flat-soled shoes pressed gentle imprints into the damp earth, step by unhurried step, just like her. She didn't linger on the site of the mansion, but she still noticed the details others would overlook: the window panes, stained by old rain, a thin film of moss clinging to the stone steps and the orange tree in the back corner of the yard, left untrimmed since last season. She said nothing, just gave a slight nod, as if promising herself that everything would be made clean again, little by little. The gate opened automatically, with no greeting, no guide, only the quiet of a once grand place now seemingly in hibernation. The butler James greeted her with a polite but cautious look. He led her down the long, marble-tiled hallway, their shadows cast side by side beneath the dim lights. Their footsteps echoed through the space, a quiet reminder that this was not a place for conversation. "The master doesn't like to be disturbed," James said as he stopped outside the kitchen, his hand on the oak door. "You'll work from 7 a.m. to 4 p.m., with an hour break for lunch. Don't enter the west wing on the second floor, that's a private area. Don't speak unless spoken to." "Any questions?" Mrs. Lila shook her head gently, her expression no more than the calm that had long settled into her features. In the soft light filtering through the kitchen window, her dark brown skin glowed warmly, her silver hair neatly pinned with an old pearl clip. She looked like someone from a long past, not rushed, not loud, but carrying something, tender and quiet like morning tea steam. James left. The door closed softly behind him, leaving her with the vast, cold kitchen. White walls, granite countertops, ebony cabinets free of scratches. Everything was spotless to the point of lifelessness. There was no scent of toasted bread, no hint of coffee, no sound of an old radio playing soft jazz like she was used to in other homes. Only silence, stretched out like a musical note that never fades. Mrs. Lila removed her gloves and began by opening the window, letting in fresh air. She didn't clean in the usual order, favored by service companies. Instead, she touched each item gently, as if listening for something. The delicate English teacups were dust-free, but void of warmth. She arranged them neatly, hoping someone might one day pick one up, pour some tea, and start a real morning. She took longer than necessary in the living room to wipe down the glass coffee table. Not because it was dirty, but because above it hung a portrait of a woman with unmoving, sorrowful eyes. The gaze in the painting seemed to follow her, not accusing, not questioning, just present enough to make her hands move a little softer than usual. She noticed the deep reverence in every object here. Each throw pillow is perfectly symmetrical, and every book on the shelf is ordered alphabetically. That kind of rigid precision didn't come from a butler's hand. It was the mark of someone who didn't allow themselves to live messily, who didn't permit emotions to disturb the order they'd built out of grief. And she understood, without needing anyone to explain. At midday, she ate a small sandwich at the auxiliary kitchen table, where sunlight slanted through the window bars and cast a soft glow across the silver strands in her hair. She didn't play music or check her phone. She chewed quietly occasionally, glancing outside at the expansive yard, where a squirrel darted past beneath the shade of a tree. By the end of the day, as she packed away her cleaning supplies and dried her hands with her towel, she still hadn't met the housemaster. But she wasn't surprised. She'd worked for people like him before, people so wealthy they'd forgotten what it felt like to be cared for, people so wounded that they no longer realized they were in pain. On her way out of the mansion, she stopped momentarily in front of the marble statue in the garden corner, an angel with one broken wing. She tilted her head, studying the old crack along the wing, then smiled softly. Not all fractures need to be hidden. Sometimes all a person needs is for someone to notice and not walk away. Tomorrow she would return, not to break the silence, but to quietly exist within it, like morning light. Like someone who understands that some places don't need dramatic change, just a pair of hands, a heart, and time. Mrs. Lila's second day at the mansion began with a light mist drifting low over the unkempt garden. It wasn't raining, but the ground was damp, as if a gentle rain had passed through during the night. She stepped onto the stone porch, her footsteps steady, carrying the calm of someone long accustomed to solitude. As she opened the front door, always left slightly ajar, a habit born of someone who had lived alone too long, she noticed faint muddy shoe prints on the hallway floor. There weren't many, just a few smudged marks, but it was the first sign of something alive in the house. She said nothing, merely bent down and wiped them clean with a damp cloth, her hands gentle, as if afraid to wound the stone beneath. Mr. Evan Caldwell had yet to appear. But she knew that didn't mean he wasn't watching. Those who have suffered deeply often do not show their emotions yet. The presence of another can quietly alter the way they stand or walk. Though he hadn't spoken a word, she could feel his gaze from somewhere cold, guarded but not entirely unfamiliar. She continued her work on the ground floor, wiping down each window pane, straightening slightly crooked picture frames, collecting a few stray leaves that had blown in through the cracks. She didn't do these things out of obligation, but because small details often reflect the mood of a house's master. A home can keep secrets better than any person ever could. Near midday, she brushed her hand lightly over the lid while dusting the piano in the sitting room, a walnut piece classical in design, its ivory keys yellowed with age. A thin layer of dust rested on it. It was not as thick as in the library, but it was enough to show that no one had played it in quite some time. She didn't open it. She merely rested her palm on the surface, as if caressing a memory that didn't belong to her. She heard a soft footstep from the second floor when she turned away to continue her work. Not loud enough to be called walking, but just enough to make her pause. Mr. Evans stood there at the top of the stairs. He didn't speak. The light filtering through the round window behind him cast his figure like a shadow caught between the present and a memory. He wore a charcoal turtleneck and ash-gray slacks. His expression was unreadable, but his pale gray eyes, like the late winter sky, held the wary look of someone used to keeping distance. "There's no need to touch the piano," he said, his voice low and even more a reminder than a command. Mrs. Lila wasn't surprised, nor did she defend herself. She nodded. "I was only dusting, sir, not playing." He looked at her for a few seconds, searching for something in her words. Not an excuse, but the truth. A truth so plain it needed no embellishment. The piano is for those who know how to use it. It's no longer necessary. "Sometimes," she replied gently, "things don't need to be useful to be worth keeping." He didn't respond, but his eyes just briefly softened. A breeze drifted through the hallway, carrying the scent of late-blooming camellias from the garden corner. He turned away, walking into the study at the end of the hall. She knew she had crossed an invisible threshold, not between master and servant, but between a locked heart and someone gentle enough not to knock. As she mopped the West Wing hallway that afternoon, she quietly avoided his room, not out of fear, but out of understanding. Private spaces sometimes require no visible boundaries to be respected. She found a basket of used white towels in the laundry room, soft but damp. She didn't call the butler. She washed and hung them with care. These seemingly small tasks she performed with a nameless tenderness, the way people once tended oil lamps before nightfall. In this mansion, everything was valuable, from the paintings on the walls to the crystal glasses. But the one thing missing was the sense that anyone had ever touched them with affection. And she didn't try to change that. She put things back in a way that made the house feel less lonely. Before leaving at the end of the day, she passed the hallway where the portrait of the woman with sad eyes hung. Mrs. Lila stood before that painting for a long while. "She was wonderful," she whispered, as if speaking to an old acquaintance. "I think he still keeps her here, so clearly." Then she turned away, leaving behind a room that seemed to sink slightly, as if brushed by a memory, waiting to come alive again. Upstairs, behind a half-closed door, Evan Caldwell leaned his forehead against the wall. Not out of exhaustion, but for the first time in years, someone had looked at the image of Evelyn without naming her with regret, but with understanding, no more, no less. And that made something inside him quiver, like a piano string gently stirred by wind. Not a sound yet, but the tremble had begun. It drizzled the next morning. Clear droplets gathered on the mansion's window panes like beads of time, contemplative, unhurried. The sky was soaked in a smoky ash hue. The trees outside trembled in the wind, and even the air carried a hint of melancholy, as if echoing a distant, forgotten song. Mrs. Lila arrived earlier than usual. No one had asked her to, but she came anyway, always present before any scheduled bell, as if the quiet of early morning was something she needed to hear the house's breath before it awakened. Today, she chose to start at the back porch. The wooden floorboards were faded, but under her patient hands, the grain darkened, as though life was returning to it. Beside the porch was a row of glass doors leading into the music room, home to the piano, and shelves lined with old sheet music. The soft light inside made the room resemble an aged photograph, its details faded but evocative. And then Mrs. Lila began to hum, a very faint tune, an old song. Her voice wasn't loud, and the words were unclear. Just breath turned into music, soft as late winter sunlight, mingling with the wind and the rustle of leaves. It was a subconscious habit she'd kept for years, whenever she cleaned spaces that once knew laughter, conversation, and perhaps once knew song. No sooner had the first few notes left her lips than she heard the glass door open abruptly. Mr. Evan Caldwell stood there unannounced. He wore a wool robe, his hair slightly tousled, his eyes icy. "Don't sing," he said. His voice wasn't raised, but sliced through the glass like a blade. Mrs. Lila stopped silent. The wind paused for a beat on the porch. "I'm sorry," she replied, soft as air yet, with the steadiness of someone long accustomed to rejection. "Mr." Evan looked at her momentarily, then stepped back, closing the door like a complete dismissal. But she saw it before the door shut. His eyes had trembled, not because of her voice, but because of the melody, an old song he hadn't heard since Evelyn's death. The song she used to hum in the kitchen while making eggs Benedict on Sunday mornings, or while knitting scarves on the porch, sunlight scattering across her auburn hair. A song he'd thought buried beneath so many winters of snow-covered memory. But today, it came alive again. From another woman's lips, another body. Yet it struck the exact chord that still lay buried in his heart. And that startled him, angered him, unsettled him. He didn't want anyone stepping into that private space. No one was allowed to touch what remained of Evelyn. No reminders, no resurrections, because he feared if he let himself remember, he would lose her all over again, and his heart, worn down by time, no longer had the strength to endure another shattering. Meanwhile, Mrs. Lila didn't protest, didn't fumble. Once the silence settled back in with the wind, she resumed her work. But this time there was no humming, only the soft brush of the broom on the wooden floor and the whisper of cloth wiping across tabletops. That afternoon she didn't eat in the kitchen as usual. She went to the back garden, sitting beneath the stone awning, holding an old book she had brought from home. But her eyes didn't truly read. Her gaze wandered often toward the glass door. She wasn't angry, nor was she sad. There was a subtle tightening in her chest, like the feeling of brushing a long-healed scar, not painful, but sharp with remembrance. Later, as she washed her hands at the laundry room basin, she discovered a small piece of paper tucked between the folds of the freshly laundered white towels from the day before. Old paper, its corners slightly yellowed. The handwriting was delicate, familiar. "If there is ever a song that makes you think of me, sing it softly. I'll be listening." no signature. But she knew it wasn't meant for her. The entire mansion was a sealed memory, a place where every room was an unfinished note, every object a sentence never completed. And Mr. Evan, no matter how silent, was still carrying all those words within him. He just no longer knew how to let them sing. Upon returning home, Mrs. Lila took a small piece of paper and wrote a few lines that evening. Not a letter, not an apology, just a short melody, the first 4 notes of that old love song she had hummed. She folded it and placed it in her coat pocket, not knowing if she would ever give it to him or keep it as her quiet secret. What awakens a locked heart is not a loud knock, but an old melody rising at the exact moment when one least expects it. On the morning of the 5th day, the rain had stopped. The sky remained overcast, but even the faint winter sunlight was enough to lift the mansion from its complete grayness. The climbing roses on the porch still held on to clear droplets, each one falling to the earth below, with a tiny sound like the heartbeat of a house that had slept too long. When Mrs. Lila entered the kitchen, the air inside was still as cold as usual. The white walls and marble countertops had never held the warmth of human presence. The 6-seat dining table hadn't been used in years, and the gas stove sat silently like a piano that had never been played. She set down her bag, removed her gloves, and opened the window beside the sink. A gentle breeze flowed in, carrying the scent of damp earth and mint from the bushes just below the porch. Today, instead of beginning with wiping down the table or sorting the fridge, she opened the 3rd drawer, the one that stored the baking tools she had noticed on her first day. A round cake pan, an electric whisk, and an old sieve with a discolored handle, all carefully stored dust-free, yet untouched. It was as if their owner had frozen everything that once brought joy, fearing that one touch might summon back a flood of memories too strong to bear. Mrs. Lila gently ran her fingers across the cool metal surfaces, feeling the stillness within each item that had once belonged to a woman now gone. Then, without a word, she lit the stove. No asking, no waiting for permission. She did only one thing: she brought life back to the kitchen. The scent of vanilla, mingled with beaten eggs and unsalted butter, melted in the oven into soft poetry, seeping into the wood grain and the doorframe's cracks. She wasn't making anything complicated, just a Southern-style apple pie she baked on gloomy days when the sky blustered or her spirit trembled. For her, it was the simplest way to remind herself that sometimes a scent could soothe an entire day. When the pie was placed on a porcelain plate, the kitchen transformed. Warmer, lived in, expectant. She set a small slice on a dessert plate beside the teapot, placing it near the coffee machine in the corner, the spot where she knew the man of the house stopped by each morning, even if only for a few minutes. The rest of the pie she didn't keep for herself. She brought it to the laundry room, gifted it to the gardener's assistant, and then stepped back outside to resume her work. About an hour later, the dessert plate was gone when she returned to the kitchen to wash a cup. No note was left behind, no thank you, and no sign. But on the counter, once a void of sterile indifference, was a neatly folded handkerchief. A linen one embroidered at the edges, the kind she'd seen only in old Southern households. No longer in use, yet deeply personal, like someone had left behind a fragment of memory in response to a presence just soft enough to stir the heart. Mrs. Lila smiled, asked no questions, expected no confirmation. That afternoon, she cleaned the southern reading room, a quiet space lined with towering bookshelves and a large window overlooking a dry lotus pond. She found an old photo album on one shelf near the writing desk. No title, no labels. She touched the spine, intending to return it to its place, but a photograph slipped out when she opened a page. It was Mr. Evan, much younger, in a silver-gray suit, standing beside a woman with wine-red hair and a radiant, tilted smile. Evelyn. They stood next to the oven in the kitchen. On the table was an apple pie identical to the one she had baked that morning. No words were needed. What had never been spoken began to take shape. Evelyn had been the soul of this kitchen, and the scent of apple pie was more than a flavor. It was a living memory, something Evan had tried to silence with 2 decades of stillness. But memories never die. They only wait for the right moment to return. Before heading home, Mrs. Lila lingered a little longer in the kitchen, gazing around at the white porcelain cups, the still warm oven, the slightly ajar window, and the lingering scent of butter in the air. This room had once been so cold that no one wanted to linger. But today, something had changed, like a space that had finally touched the past again, without fear of being crushed by it. Perhaps what a kitchen needs most isn't fire, but a reason to light it again. And sometimes, an apple pie so simple it might go unnoticed is the perfect overture to a healing once thought too late to begin. A rare, clear day followed the long stretch of overcast skies that had draped over the Caldwell mansion like a ribbon of silvery gray. The winter sunlight wasn't warm, but it was enough to cast slender beams through the old oak canopy. In the southern courtyard, pale green moss peeked out from the morning mist, the first signs that the season was quietly shifting. Mrs. Lila arrived as usual, her posture upright, a wool shawl draped gently over her shoulders, her eyes calm but not tired. After cleaning the main areas, she passed through the hallway to the back porch, where an old wicker chair sat beneath the round window, a corner seemingly forgotten by time. The knitting chair wasn't new. Its woven strands had faded, and the seat sagged slightly, shaped by the form of someone who had once sat there often and for a long time. Resting atop it was a ball of deep reddish-brown yarn, the kind few people choose, yet one that evoked an oddly soothing warmth. Mrs. Lila touched the yarn gently, her fingers caressing its soft strands, clearly once handled with great care. It wasn't something a maid had forgotten, nor a decorative object placed there for convenience. It belonged to someone. It carried memory. She sat in the chair and opened the small fabric pouch she always carried. From it, she pulled out a pair of old knitting needles. Her practiced fingers began to move the yarn, sliding smoothly through each loop, forming rows of stitches as steady as breath. Before long, a scarf began to take shape, the reddish-brown hue glowing in the twilight, like red wine poured into crystal on the dinner tables of long-married lovers. A few minutes later, footsteps paused at the window behind her. Mrs. Lila didn't turn around, but the stretch of light falling across the wooden floor told her exactly who had come. "What are you doing?" Mr. Evans' voice came through, not harsh, but unfamiliar, with seeing someone occupy a space that had been vacant for so long. "I'm knitting a scarf," Mrs. Lila replied, her hands never slowing. "I usually do when the weather is nice, and when the heart feels a little cold." A pause. "Who's it for?" "I don't know yet," she answered, eyes still following the rhythm of the stitches. "Sometimes I knit just to fill a space. Not the space around the neck, but the one inside." He didn't respond, but he didn't leave either. He stood there quietly, his gaze seemingly fixed on her hands, those slow, gentle movements, as if drawing something ancient, very familiar into existence. He remembered Evelyn used to sit there. During the first winter, they moved into the mansion, she had sat beneath that same window, knitting his first scarf for him. It had been the same reddish-brown. He had laughed then, teasing her that the color looked like aged wine. She had smiled and said, "Because you always remind me of an old glass of red, hard to swallow, but warm." The smell of damp yarn, the clink of needles, the silhouette leaning into the afternoon light, it all rushed back like a tide tightening in his chest. "Have you ever been in love?" he asked suddenly, as if the question had slipped from his thoughts. Mrs. Lila paused, then looked up at him. Her expression held no surprise, only a gentle calm, as if the question was inevitable for a heart that had only begun to beat again. "I have," she replied. "A carpenter. He wasn't wealthy, but he always knew how to keep the house warm in winter and my heart steady on stormy nights. Where is he now?" "He went before me, 14 years ago," she said, her voice as light as a breeze. "Cancer. But I still knit scarves, as if his hands were still here somewhere, holding every strand I weave." A yellow leaf drifted down onto the porch. Mr. Evan turned away, his hand brushing the window frame, as if touching an unnamed memory. Mrs. Lila lowered her gaze and continued knitting. The loops tightened and became sturdier. In her heart, there was no pity, no curiosity, only quiet understanding, the only kind gentle enough to touch a frozen heart without breaking it further. As the sun began to dip behind the trees, their shadows stretched across the tiled floor, not touching, but facing the same direction toward the setting sun. One had known loss and chosen silence. The other had known loss and continued to hum in its midst. And between them, the scarf in progress, loop by loop, row by row, unhurried and unforced, just steady, like a wordless song, for hearts learning how to remember without falling apart. On the 7th day, the air turned brisk. Charleston remained wrapped in the hush of a winter that had not yet brought snow, but had already urged people to bury themselves deeper in scarves and retreat into their quiet. Within the mansion, long shadowed by time, change arrived not with sound, but with sensation, a vague yet undeniable feeling that warmth had begun to seep in. Mr. Evans sat alone in the study beside the old fireplace. Mrs. Lila had recently cleared of ash and polished to reveal the copper trim. In his hands was a leather-bound book, though his eyes did not read. The firelight danced on the mirror's surface, scattering small flickers of light, like fragments of memory things he had tried to bury, but never truly left. Outside, the soft scrape of a broom brushing fallen leaves echoed faintly from the front porch. He knew it was her. The woman who didn't speak much, didn't appear suddenly, or push anyone to open up, but left traces behind with a gentle, almost imperceptible patience. Something about her made him feel less guarded, even as he kept his distance. Near noon, as he stepped into the kitchen, a habit newly formed in the past few days, he found her wiping the old wall clock. The face had yellowed. Its second hand moved slowly, but never stopped. Light from the window caught her hair, making the silver strands glint, like threads stitching seasons together. "I remember that clock used to run behind," he said softly, but clearly. Mrs. Lila turned to him, not surprised. "It still works, just forgotten for too long. She used to reset it every week." He added, his voice slow, as if relaying something he hadn't planned to share. "Evelyn, my wife. She hated being late." She nodded gently, not interrupting the memory, simply setting down the cloth and offering him a seat. Not with words, but with a glance, a simple hand movement, quiet, yet full of grace. They sat across from each other at the small table in the kitchen's corner. On the table were 2 steaming cups of tea, another quiet habit Mrs. Lila had started without asking, but he hadn't objected. The soft scent of cinnamon tea drifted through the old kitchen, making the room feel closer, warmer than all the lonely years combined. "I used to be a teacher." She spoke first as he watched the sunlight stretch across the tiled floor. "At a small elementary school on the city's edge, over 20 years, until the school closed due to a lack of funding." He looked up slightly, his expression showing a quiet kind of surprise. "You don't seem like a teacher, and you don't seem like someone who once knew how to love." She smiled gently, with no intent to wound. "But I think we've both been different people before." A silence followed. not awkward, not forced, like a slow melody giving space for one to listen. "I used to think I'd never need anyone again," he admitted, eyes turned toward the window where tree shadows fell over the now dry steps. "Evelyn, she wasn't just my wife. She was the reason I learned how to slow down, cook dinner, and read poetry. When she died, everything froze." She didn't interrupt, just stirred her tea gently, the spoon tapping the cup like a soft drumbeat, signaling a heart beginning to stir. "You don't have to continue if it's too heavy," she said, her gaze meeting his, not pressing but like a riverbank waiting for someone tired to come home. "No," he shook his head slightly. "Strange, but I want to. Even if just a few words." He told her about Evelyn picking lavender in the garden at dusk, how she used to skip down the hallway when she got good news, and how he saw her smile at the old gardener, who was even older than he was. A smile that made him jealous and then ashamed of his pettiness. Small things, but the kind only someone who had truly loved would remember. Mrs. Lila listened, no nodding, no tears. Like a blank page, she was there ready for each line of memory to be written slowly and understood. "When my husband died," she began, after a long pause, "I lost the only person who knew every fear in my heart. He used to fix every broken chair and every loose stair. After he passed, I'd still hear the sound of his hammer at night." Their eyes met, not to search, but to confirm that both had once shattered, had rebuilt pieces of their lives with bare hands and fractured hearts. They didn't say much after that, just sat for a while longer with 2 cooling cups of tea in a kitchen, warmed by angled sunlight seeping through the curtains, casting soft golden squares on the cold tile floor. And sometimes, a first conversation doesn't need many words. Only enough for 2 people to realize that pain, when shared at the right moment, no longer feels like a wound, but becomes a seam quietly and steadily stitching together what was once torn inside each of them. That night, the cold came suddenly. Wind rustled through the bare oak branches, whispering like echoes of the past. Outside, the iron gate remained shut, faint lights from the garden lamps casting a pale glow across the gravel path leading to the mansion, making everything resemble a frozen painting, still frigid and shaped by memory. Mr. Evan couldn't sleep. Ever since Evelyn had passed, his sleep had been patchy, fragile as smoke. Some nights he tossed and turned until dawn. Other nights, he drifted off from exhaustion only to wake in the darkness, chest heavy with unnameable weight. But tonight was different. It wasn't just insomnia. It was an unease that lingered just beyond the glass window, where silver moonlight reflected his silhouette on the floor, long and alone, like his life had been since the day his wife died. He dreamed. A colorless dream. Evelyn stood in the living room, wearing the soft white dress she used to favor on spring evenings. She said nothing, just smiled, her hand reaching out as if inviting him into the back garden. Her hair danced in the wind, her eyes untouched by time, still clear as the day they met. He tried to step toward her, but his legs felt bound by a heavy fog. She stood there for a moment longer, then slowly stepped back, fading with each pace until she disappeared beneath the lavender bush that had long withered through many seasons. He jolted awake. The room was pitch dark, the only sound the steady ticking of the wall clock, a reminder that time marched on whether or not one wished to pause at a particular moment. His heart pounded. His nightshirt was damp with cold sweat. He sat up, bare feet, meeting the chill of the wooden floor. He opened the door and walked down the hallway like a sleepwalker, each step slow, heavy, carrying with it the scent of an ancient sorrow rising once more in his chest. He stopped in the center of the living room, before Evelyn's portrait. The moonlight slanted through the tall windows, landing squarely on the face of the woman in the painting. That gentle smile, those luminous eyes, everything he had once loved, held, and lost. His body felt pinned beneath her gaze, and then before stopping it, he dropped to his knees. Not from age, but from a weight that had pressed down on him for 20 years. His voice broke into the night. "I'm sorry." An apology not aimed at a single mistake, but for everything, for not holding on to her that day, for the words he never said, for the nights he merely existed without truly living. Outside, the wind howled, shaking the glass panes. The moon shimmered like the blink of a weary sky. And while he remained bowed before her image, the kitchen light flicked on behind him. Mrs. Lila stood there. She didn't approach. She didn't speak. She didn't ask why he was there in the middle of the night. Didn't ask why his shoulders were trembling. She placed a gray knitted blanket on the side table, made by hand light, yet surprisingly warm. Then she sat across from him in the opposite chair, silent, still, like a small flame placed beside a fire of grief. He didn't look up, but he knew she was there. Knew her presence was not invasive, not pitying, just present. His tears fell to the cold marble floor for the first time in 20 years. Not because Evelyn was gone, but because he realized he had never truly allowed himself to cry for her. They sat there in silence, one unraveling the other, listening with all the gentleness the world had left in her. And the space between them, once filled with unspoken distances, no one dared to cross, softened, like the slow-burning glow of a fire behind them. As dawn approached, he rose, picked up the blanket Mrs. Lila had left, and nodded. No words of thanks, but something had thawed in his gaze, like ice cracking under the first sunlight of spring. He walked back upstairs, his steps light like someone who had left some of his sorrow behind. And she, once he had disappeared, touched the armrest where he had sat, then quietly returned to her small room behind the kitchen. Neither of them said a word. But from that night on, a small door opened in the mansion, which stood silent like a beautiful tomb, without sound, but wide enough for the wind to slip through, carrying with it the things thought long dead, bringing them back gently, more alive and more honest than ever before. That morning, Charleston was veiled in a fine mist, like a sheer white veil draped across the garden behind the mansion. Dew still clung to the leaves, and on the brittle lavender branches, long thought dead, tiny green buds peeked through. Just that alone was enough to stir a faint ache of hope for rebirth in the human heart. Mrs. Lila was carefully polishing the old brass handles beneath the stone counter in the kitchen. Her hands moved with familiar gentleness and rhythm, like someone soothing a sulking child, slow, but never careless. The kettle began to whistle softly on the stove, releasing steam that spread through the room, curling into corners long accustomed to silence. Ever since the night Mr. Evan had wept in the living room, something in the house had changed, not dramatically, but undeniably. He still didn't speak much, but his eyes, the way he came downstairs each morning, the way he left a neatly folded handkerchief beside the teapot she had already poured, all carried something softer, slower, like the early mist melting just enough to reveal the faintest light behind it. That day, Mrs. Lila went upstairs to clean the library, a room he rarely visited, but which she still tidied weekly, as if it were part of an old ritual. She pulled each book down, wiped the spine, straightened them, and returned them to the shelves. When her hand happened upon a low drawer, hidden behind the dark wood desk, it opened with a faint click, like a long-held breath finally released. Inside was a stack of old documents, yellowed paper, mostly bills, letters, notices. But among the faded sheets, she found one envelope thicker than the rest, not sealed but folded with great care. On its surface was handwriting, feminine, gently slanted, like it had been written on a sunny afternoon. If one day you are brave enough to open. She hesitated. The envelope was already in her hand, but she didn't rush. She was not a curious woman, much less an intruder into someone's private world. But something tugged at her, not to satisfy a question, but like a soft thread, pulling her closer to the loneliness she had quietly seen in Mr. Evan. She placed the envelope on the desk, tapped lightly on the office door, and walked away. Not long after he appeared, his tall frame filling the doorway like a memory not yet fully formed. When he saw the envelope, his steps faltered. His eyes rested on the inscription, and he slowly pulled out a chair and sat down. No words, only hands that had signed countless contracts now trembling as they opened each delicate sheet of paper. Inside were handwritten letters, a few pages. Evelyn's handwriting still holding the faint scent of lavender, mixed with old paper like memory, finally escaping from a place it had long been sealed. My dearest Evan, I am likely no longer by your side if you are reading this. Don't be angry with me for writing this. I know you know how you retreat when you're hurting. I hope that by the time you open this, your heart has stopped resenting the world. The lines were short, but overflowing with everything she had never said aloud. Evelyn wrote of the fear she felt upon discovering her illness, of the nights she woke drenched in cold sweat, but didn't dare wake him. She wrote about quietly buying him that leather jacket he loved during their final winter together, the one he'd searched for, but never remembered why it had vanished. I don't want you to live like someone buried alongside me, Evan. You deserve sunlight, hot tea in the morning, pastries, and someone gentle enough to understand your sadness without touching it too deeply. The final page ended in a hurried scrawl, her handwriting visibly trembling. If there is laughter in our house again one day, don't be afraid. Let it echo, because I'll be there listening. He didn't read it aloud, but his lips moved, whispering each word, and in his eyes, waves of emotion surged with every line. Mrs. Lila stood just outside the hallway, not entering. She heard the chair shift softly, followed by a silence stretching longer than the afternoon. But it wasn't a frightening silence. It was like the quiet after a rain, everything no longer chaotic, but slower, deeper. That evening, Mr. Evans stepped into the back garden, which had been open since Evelyn's death for the first time in years. He strolled past the old lavender bushes, past the stone path where a few tiles had sunk, and stopped in front of the white wooden bench where Evelyn used to sit. The bench was weathered, its paint peeling, but when he sat down, it let out a faint creak like a soft greeting. In his hand was the letter folded carefully. The afternoon sun slanted low, casting golden light across his shoulders. The wind brushed through his hair light, as the touch of a hand long accustomed to cradling him in old dreams. Mrs. Lila did not appear that evening, not because she wasn't there, but because she understood some evenings one must sit alone with words that never age, to realize that love isn't only of the present, but something that gives us the courage to keep living, even when our hearts have been broken over and over. And sometimes all it takes is an old letter found at the right moment, for the past to smile again, for the present to feel less alone, and for the future to begin once more, even if late. On the 10th afternoon, the rain came. It arrived suddenly, like an emotion too swift to name, steady, insistent, but not fierce. It fell in slow, rhythmic waves like droplets of memory descending from the sky, washing the earth, seeping into every crack between the bricks of the mansion courtyard. The old oak tree stood silently beneath the rainfall, its wet leaves pressed against one another, as if seeking warmth in the grayness. In the living room, Mr. Evans sat by the window, eyes fixed on the streaks of rain sliding down the glass. The rain blurred everything outside: landscape color, even time. Each droplet fell like a heartbeat he'd tried for years to steady in the quiet of solitude. Every soft patter on the tiled roof was a gentle knock on a door that hadn't been touched in years. In this weather, Evelyn would never go outside. She used to hate the rain. Not because it was cold or inconvenient, but because it made her feel adrift. She would say, "Rain is when people get most lost in thought memory and each other." When she was alive, rainy days meant the kitchen lights came on early. There was ginger tea and scented candles. Rain was an excuse for her to make their home feel warmer. But now, it only made him feel colder. Yet this afternoon, when the gate bell rang, he instinctively turned. Through the curtain of rain, a familiar figure appeared. Mrs. Lila. The woman who, despite the downpour, hadn't missed a day. In her hand was a dark brown umbrella, just big enough to shield her frame, but not broad enough to keep the hem of her skirt from getting damp. Her coat had darkened with rain, her hair slightly tousled, but her steps remained steady, just like every other time she had arrived. Mr. Evan opened the front door, not out of politeness, but because at that moment he felt he should be the one to open a door, if only once. "You didn't have to come today," he said, his voice rougher from surprise than reproach. "Not in this rain." Mrs. Lila offered a soft smile, set her umbrella gently in the corner, and rubbed her hands together to chase away the chill. "No rain is worse than a lonely soul, sir," she replied, as though the words had been drawn from the deepest place of lived truth. Her words stopped him, not because they were poetic, but because they were too close, actual, too real. It was so real that something inside him sank like an old song quietly playing again after too long. He stepped aside and let her in. The house instantly felt warmer, not just because the golden lights were on, but because her presence carried a kind of warmth logic could never explain. In the kitchen, she boiled water and took a small jar of ginger and a few slices of fresh lemon from her bag. She didn't ask permission, nor did she need instruction. Every motion she made was gentle and precise, as though this kitchen had long been familiar to her hands. Mr. Evan sat at the table watching her slice the ginger. Her fingers were slender, her movements slow but steady. The hands of someone who had once smoothed a child's hair, held a dying husband's hand, and picked fallen leaves from a porch without complaining. The hands of someone who had lived fully grieved deeply, and still had enough tenderness to step into someone else's loneliness without rushing it. "I can't remember the last time this house smelled like ginger tea," he said, his voice carrying a closeness that surprised even him. "Maybe it was the last time someone was waiting to pour it for you," she answered, pouring water into 2 white porcelain cups, one of which had a small chip at the rim, yet was placed carefully beside the plate of biscuits she had brought. They sat silently, the only music being the rain falling on the porch outside, accompanying this strange, quiet afternoon. Mr. Evan brought the tea to his lips and sipped. The warm, spicy ginger spread across his palate, down into his chest. "Aren't you afraid of getting wet?" he asked, eyes glancing at the damp hem of her skirt. "There are rains you have to walk through to know your heart still feels," she replied, her gaze meeting his, not piercing, but quietly penetrating. "And there are people who need to see someone still show up, even knowing they might get cold." He gave a slight nod. Inside him, no more storms, just the sound of an exhale released after too many years of holding it in. When she was ready to leave, he stood, not out of etiquette, but out of instinct, a reflex not to let her disappear into the rain again without something to remain behind. "Your umbrella," he said, stepping out before her. She looked at him, raising an eyebrow, a silent question. "Let me cover you this time," he said. "It's still raining." She didn't refuse. They stepped onto the porch together, their steps even quiet. Beneath the brown umbrella, Their shoulders nearly touched. Neither of them moved away. The rain kept falling, not heavy now, but still enough to soften the air and open up a path toward things long forgotten. Later, the mansion's front door would hang that umbrella, no longer wet or alone. And for the first time in 20 years, there was an object marked by two people who shared a rain, shared a silence, and shared a moment neither of them wished to leave. That day, the sun broke through after many gray days. The last ribbons of lingering clouds slowly retreated toward the horizon. Morning light gently stretched across the mansion's roof like a warm hand, softly pulling away the wool blanket of a long frozen dream. Lila rearranged the spice jars in the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron before gently opening the refrigerator. A bundle of cilantro wrapped with care, a few ripe tomatoes, a tray of lightly marinated chicken. Everything seemed already waiting, though it wasn't clear who had prepared it. What was clear was that for several days now, Mr. Evan had quietly noticed what was missing after each morning tea. And since then, the kitchen has been just a little more complete with each passing day. Today, she decided to cook something familiar, a traditional South American dish she had learned from her mother: pollo guisado, stewed chicken with tomatoes, cilantro, black pepper, and bay leaves. Rich in flavor, lightly spicy sweet at the finish, like a woman who once loved deeply and now lives through memory. As the clay pot gently bubbled with boiling broth, she set the table for the first time, not for one. The 6-seat dining table remained, but she chose the corner near the window, where sunlight filtered through the voile curtains, creating a soft glow, like a smile just beginning to bloom. 2 white porcelain plates, 2 glasses of water, and 2 cutlery sets were placed symmetrically. At the center was a vase of dried lavender, the flower that made Evelyn laugh whenever the wind knocked its petals to the floor. Mr. Evan appeared just as she was scooping rice. No footsteps. His presence constantly subtly shifted the atmosphere, as if the room itself recognized someone familiar had returned. "Smells good," he said, eyes on the steaming pot. "Stewed chicken," she replied evenly. "I made more than one serving." He didn't ask why. He pulled out a chair and sat across from her, as if he had done it 100 times, though in truth, this was the first time he had shared a meal in this kitchen with anyone since Evelyn passed. They ate in silence, but it was not an awkward silence, the kind from 2 souls long accustomed to absence, now relearning how to sit beside someone else. The chicken was flavorful, rich, but not overwhelming. "It's excellent," he said, almost surprised after the first bite. "I've never had anything like it." "Because you've never sat at the table with someone who knows how to make it," she said with a smile, not boastful, but simply matter-of-fact. He looked at her for a moment, then nodded slowly. In his eyes, there wasn't just acknowledgement of the food, but of something he had long avoided. Life had returned to this kitchen, which wasn't frightening. After the meal, she began to clear the table. He moved to help, but she stopped him with a slight shake. "You should sit a little longer. It's a beautiful day." He stayed and they talked. Not about grand things, just scattered bits of memory woven between 2 people who had lived very different lives but had experienced loss in strangely similar ways. She told him about her late husband, a carpenter, a quiet man good with his hands. "He couldn't write poetry," she said, "but he built me a cabinet with a hidden compartment only I knew about. Inside, he kept letters he never sent." "Did you ever read them?" Evan asked. "No, I don't think they needed to be read. Writing them was enough." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he spoke of Evelyn in a steady voice for the first time, like rereading a beloved chapter of a book he'd long feared opening. He told of the time she got lost in Rome because she refused to carry a map of the lemon tart she spent a month learning to perfect, and the last time they danced to the sound of an old radio when she was already growing weak, but still smiled beneath the chandelier light. She loved the light, he murmured, as if to himself. But she left on a night without a moon. No, Mrs. Lila replied, eyes on the vase of dried lavender. She's still in the light. You just haven't turned it back on. The words struck him. Not because they hurt, but because they were true. So true that they eased a weight he'd carried for too long. She said nothing more. Quietly stood, dried her hands, and left the kitchen, leaving him alone among the lingering scent of stewed chicken, the soft clink of spoon against porcelain, and a kind of emotion threading through his chest. To be shared. To be understood. To sit beside someone without hiding the emptiness, without rushing to fill it. That meal wasn't a miracle. It didn't make Evan forget Evelyn, and it didn't erase the pain. But it was like the first heartbeat after years of thinking the heart had stopped. And for someone who once loved deeply, sometimes all it takes is a warm afternoon, a simple dish, and someone patient enough to sit across from you, to begin returning to life one quiet step at a time. That day, the wind blew strongly. Not the kind of wind fierce enough to tear off rooftops, but the January chill that cuts through skin and bone in silence, brushing past window frames, like a reminder that time continues to pass, even when the heart longs to linger in a season long gone. Inside the Caldwell mansion, Mr. Evan came downstairs later than usual. He no longer placed the newspaper on the tray early in the morning, nor brought coffee up to his study, as had been his ritual for many years. This morning, he woke up with a strange feeling, not quite sadness or joy, but something subtly stirred within him, like a string gently tugged by an unseen hand. When he reached the living room window, he saw Mrs. Lila sitting on the back porch. She was knitting as usual, but unlike other days, she was smiling quietly. Her lips curved softly, her eyes lowered, not fully revealing her emotions, but enough to make him stop. That smile wasn't radiant, nor was it deliberate. It was a faint trace, like a pencil sketch on coarse paper, but it stirred something deep within him, a place he had long sealed off with refusals, empty nods, and silent afternoons, sipping tea with nothing but the tick of a pendulum clock for company. That smile. It was just like Evelyn's. So much so that he had to steady himself on the window frame, not because she resembled Evelyn in her features, but because she didn't. Evelyn had porcelain white skin, brown eyes, a petite chin, and a delicate figure like a classical sonata left unfinished. Lila, by contrast, bore the seasoned beauty of someone who had weathered life. Her deep walnut skin, polished like stained wood, her posture steady with the grace of a woman who had faced every kind of storm. But that smile, it carried the same kind of light that made you believe that no matter how fractured life became, there was still something tender left to hold on to. Mr. Evan turned away and walked into the study, where the lighting was dim and the space even more silent than his heart. He poured himself a small glass of whiskey, but did not drink. He just held the glass in his hand, watching the amber liquid swirl gently with the motion of his fingers. Memory surged back like an undercurrent. 18 years ago, Evelyn had sat in that very spot one winter afternoon. She had smiled at him, tilted quiet, just like that, when he joked that she could make the garden bloom with a glance. She didn't respond with words, just lifted his glass of whiskey, took a sip, and left a faint red lipstick mark on the rim, the same glass he kept for years after. Unwashed, unused, preserved on a shelf like a piece of living memory he didn't dare disturb. And now that smile had returned, from someone else. It filled him with gratitude and fear. Gratitude for the fleeting sense of life returned to a moment he thought was lost forever. Fear, because he wasn't sure if he remembered Evelyn, or was beginning to see Lila through eyes that had started to tremble. He was already there when Mrs. Lila entered the kitchen to prepare tea that afternoon. He was not seated as usual, but was standing by the window, hands in his pockets, his posture leaning slightly toward the light. She saw him, but said nothing at first. He turned around. "Did you know," he began, "your smile looks like hers." Her hands paused for a second, but she showed no surprise. "I didn't know," she replied, her voice low and gentle. "But I believe some smiles don't belong to just one person." He looked at her for a long time. "That's what confuses me," he said slowly. "I've lived too long in the shadow of the past. And then, one day I see that smile on someone else's face. I don't know who I'm remembering anymore." Lila set the teacup down on the table. Her gaze didn't avoid his, nor did she try to soothe his words kindly. She looked at him like someone who had walked through that same terrain and understood the quiet pathways within the heart. "You're remembering yourself," she said. "The version of you who once loved, who once truly lived. And that smile doesn't make you forget her. It only reminds you that perhaps some part of your heart never fully closed." He didn't respond. He only lowered his head, fingers gently tapping the wooden table. That gesture, so small, but for a man who had long learned to hide his feelings, it was the first crack in the wall. The two sat there, not close yet, not distant. Between them, no confessions were made. Only a half-finished, rust-colored knitted scarf lay on the table between them, each stitch a heartbeat, a bridge between a man who once loved fiercely and a woman quietly sewing her life back together with threads of patience. The late afternoon sun slanted into the kitchen, casting warm light across Lila's cheek. And Mr. Evan realized it wasn't that she looked like Evelyn. It was that his heart at last had grown peaceful enough to smile back at someone, even if only for a fleeting moment, unnamed, undefined. There was no rain that day, but the air carried a sorrow too elusive to name. Low-hanging clouds stretched across the tops of the oak trees, and the sunlight seemed caught behind the heavy sky, leaving only a pale white glow filtering through the windows, casting over the floor like a thin sheet woven from faded days. Inside the Caldwell mansion, everything sat in silence, as if waiting for something to happen slowly, but inevitably. Mr. Evans sat in the study. In front of him lay a rust-colored knitted scarf, now finished and neatly folded on the table. Every stitch was even, precise, and strangely warm. Mrs. Lila had left it there the evening before, with no note, no question, just a quiet offering. Beside it sat Evelyn's old letter, the one he had read dozens of times over the past few days. The paper's edges were creased, the ink smudged in places, but each time he opened it, the words pierced him just the same, gentle but unrelenting. "If one day there's laughter again in our home, don't be afraid." That line made his chest tighten, not because of memory, but because he had laughed, just a little. At lunch the day before, Lila told him about when she took shelter under a stranger's porch and accidentally uprooted a fake potted plant, thinking it was a weed. The story wasn't hilarious, but he had laughed. A soft chuckle, enough to feel himself alive again, not just a quiet shadow moving through his own house. And that more than anything made him feel like a traitor. A traitor to the woman he had once loved so deeply, he believed there could never be room in his heart for anyone else. That fear caused him to retreat all day. He didn't go to the kitchen, didn't sit in his usual chair, didn't let Lila see him. She paused at the study's threshold as she prepared to leave late in the afternoon. He sat there slightly hunched, clutching a teacup that had long since gone cold. "Are you all right?" she asked softly. He looked up. Just for a moment, their eyes met. His gaze no longer belonged to a man hiding behind memories. It was the look of someone who had just walked through the deepest corridors of his heart and wasn't sure if he had come out whole. "I think I'm starting to forget Evelyn," he said. Lila stepped in slowly, unhurried, without pressure. She sat in the chair across from him. No tea, no scarf in hand, just her two hands resting gently on her lap, ready to listen fully. "You know," he continued, "I used to think that if I ever loved someone else, I had erased Evelyn from my heart. I was so afraid of that. I kept everything the same. The chairs, the paintings, even the room where she died still smells like her perfume." "You haven't forgotten her," Lila said gently. "You're loving her in a more grown-up way now by continuing to live." A single drop fell. He didn't notice it at first, only that his eyes were wet, his throat tight, and everything inside him cracked open like glass, long fractured, but only now finally giving way. The first tear landed on the knitted scarf. No one spoke. The room was filled only with the clock's ticking and the uneven breathing of a man allowing himself to cry, honestly cry for the first time in 20 years. Like an orphaned child, finally held by someone who wouldn't say, "Be strong." Like a collapsed roof that made way for light to pour in. Lila didn't wipe away his tears, didn't try to soothe him. She sat there offering the full presence of someone who knows how to listen, allowing him to be vulnerable without feeling small. When he had finally calmed, he lifted his head. His eyes were still red but clear. "Are you afraid?" he asked. "Afraid to love again? After losing so much?" She smiled this time, a complete smile, unhidden, carrying both gentleness and sorrow. "I'm not afraid to love again," she replied. "I'm only afraid of living the rest of my life without giving anyone the chance to touch my heart again." He nodded slightly. His hand reached for the scarf, gently tracing the yarn now soaked with his tears. In that moment, he was no longer the proud widower living behind cold walls. He was simply a man, relearning how to be loved. Night had fallen completely. No one turned on the light. But maybe they didn't need to, because the light had already begun to glow from the deepest places of two hearts once shattered, where if given enough patience, enough gentleness, and enough honesty, the things we thought had died can be brought back to life. Not loudly, not grandly, just with a single tear, and someone who stayed until the end of the day. That morning the sun rose earlier than usual. There were no more gray clouds or mist draped like mourning veils over the roof of the Caldwell mansion. Instead, a gentle golden light poured through the windows, slicing through the freshly cleaned glass Mrs. Lila had polished the week before. Sunlight settled on the tiled floor, like faded lipstick traces, left after a long kiss, faint, thin, but still there. Mr. Evan woke up before the clock chimed, not because of a short night's sleep, but because of a strange sensation: peace. For the first time in 20 years, he didn't feel hollow in the middle of the night. The room no longer felt like a cocoon of memory. It still held traces of Evelyn, the photo frame on the table, the beanbag chair where she read the half-finished knit blanket, but the air didn't sting like it used to. Something had softened, quieted. It was as if Evelyn's presence was still there, but no longer as a shackle, more like a final blessing. He went downstairs, and for the first time, he willingly stepped into the kitchen. The lights were already on. Mrs. Lila stood at the dining table rearranging the jar of dried lavender. A dark wooden box on the table, its lid closed, sat neatly like a gift yet to be opened. She heard his footsteps, but didn't turn around. It was as if she already knew he would come. "Tea is ready," she said. her voice low and steady, like the opening note of a morning symphony. He watched her gently turn a porcelain cup in her hands, then quietly pulled out a chair and sat across from her. They didn't speak for a few minutes. The ticking of the clock, the sound of tea pouring into cups, and the soft rustle of sunlight through the curtains all formed a new rhythm, slow but no longer heavy. Finally, he pushed the wooden box toward her. "For you." She looked up, her eyebrows lightly furrowing, not in surprise, but because of the solemn way he placed the gift down. "You didn't have to." "I know," he interrupted, but his voice was softer than any he had used before. "But I want to." She opened the box. Inside was the rust-colored scarf she had knitted, folded carefully, wrapped in tissue paper, and a small card resting on top. His handwriting was straight, neat, and every stroke carefully considered. "Thank you for stitching back the part of my heart I thought was forever torn." She didn't cry, but in her eyes a light was softer than the morning sun. "You could have kept it," she said gently, brushing her fingers across the scarf. "I've kept too many things for too long," he replied. "But this time, I want it to stay with the one who created it." There was no subtext, no embellishment, just the honesty of a man who had once lost everything and was now relearning how to give. Mrs. Lila looked at him longer than a single breath. So she said, "At last, is this the first time you've given something to someone since Evelyn?" "No." He shook his head slightly. "It's the first time I've given something without comparing it to her." Silence. But it was the most beautiful silence, an admission, an apology, and a beginning, all wrapped in a glance exchanged between two people who had walked through far too many broken seasons. After tea, she tidied up the table. He didn't walk away like usual. He stood by the window looking out at the garden. The old lavender bush had begun to sprout a few green shoots there. Tiny, fresh. Much like himself, a man once frozen in the winter of memory, now quietly becoming someone else. It is not entirely new, but it has changed enough to truly understand what it means to be present in a moment. Before she left, he spoke. "If the weather's nice tomorrow, would you stay for dinner?" She paused at the doorway. Back straight, bag in hand, she didn't turn around. "Do you even know how to cook?" "No," he answered, "but I can read a recipe." A soft laugh escaped her, gentle, honest, and full of light. She stepped outside, leaving behind the scent of cinnamon tea and sunlight pouring into the kitchen like an unspoken promise. He turned back in and walked to the bookshelf. For the first time, he reached for an old cookbook Evelyn had once left behind. The cover was worn and a few pages were marked. The last one bookmarked was a recipe for honey-roasted chicken with herb potatoes. He smiled, because what Evelyn left behind wasn't just a loss, but a light bright enough for him to finally see. Moving on didn't mean forgetting. It meant being brave enough to create new memories. Right inside the house, once filled with shadows. Spring returned to Charleston as slowly as a wordless melody, each note carried by the gentle breeze and golden sunlight filtering through the revived trees after a long, cold winter. In the Caldwell estate garden, lavender bloomed in soft purple hues, nestled among patches of wild grass that no one had the heart to pull anymore. Because here, even the untamed had been seen and loved with the gentlest eyes. That morning, the white wooden bench beneath the porch had been freshly cleaned. Draped across it was a rust-colored knitted scarf, not for warmth, but as a quiet presence of days gone by. Mr. Evans stepped into the garden, holding 2 cups of tea, his steps steady, as if he were already used to having someone waiting. Mrs. Lila had sat there for a while, gazing into the open sky behind the oak trees. She didn't speak, just smiled softly as he approached, a smile that carried the peace of things no longer needing to be hidden. They sat together silently, like 2 rivers that had wandered many paths, only to meet finally. No grand declarations, no promises beneath the moonlight. Just being there in that moment was enough. The night before he had cooked dinner. The honey-roasted chicken was slightly burnt at the edges, and the herb potatoes were still a bit underdone, but Mrs. Lila ate it all without complaint. After the meal, he led her to the second floor and opened Evelyn's room for the first time in 20 years. Nothing had changed in that room, but it no longer felt cold. On the desk sat an old picture frame inside a photo of Evelyn, smiling a smile that looked much like Lila's that evening. "She wouldn't be sad," Lila whispered, "if you gave your heart one more season to bloom." And he had nodded, not to let go of the past, but to embrace the present, an imperfect present, yet real enough to make a man grateful he could still feel. That evening, as the sun slowly faded from the garden, Mr. Evan opened the piano lid. Mrs. Lila sat beside him, not touching the keys, simply watching as he tried to find the rhythm of fingers long asleep. He played the first few notes, slow, imperfect, but full of soul. Then, Lila softly began to sing the love song from back then. The one Evelyn used to love. The one he had long feared to hear again. But this time, the song didn't carry pain, only remembrance. And love, gentle, like the last warmth of day. They never addressed each other by first name, never changed how they spoke. Neither needed a new definition for the quiet bond forming between two people shaped by loss. They only needed to be themselves side by side as the day passed and the night came like two open doors trusting the breeze to pass through. A month later, James the housekeeper returned from an extended leave, surprised to find the mansion filled with light. The kitchen smelled of fresh-baked pastries. The fireplace glowed every night, and in the living room hung a new painting, a portrait of a knitted scarf on a woven chair with the early garden blooming behind it. James asked Mr. Evan, "A new painting, sir?" He nodded, his eyes quietly lit. "No, a portrait of a season. I thought I'd never get to live again." By late spring, the lavender in the garden was in full bloom. The purple petals touched the sunlight memories and the hearts of those who once believed love belonged only to the young, unbroken hearts. But it didn't. Love doesn't follow a schedule. It arrives when we are quiet enough to hear it, brave enough to release the past, while holding on to gratitude, and gentle enough to recognize that happiness is sometimes simply sitting beside someone, quietly weaving back a torn life with threads of patience and understanding. And Mr. Evan, the man who had frozen his heart for 2 decades, cried, then smiled, then came back to life. Because he had found no replacement for Evelyn, but someone quiet enough, deep enough, and real enough to make him open his heart once more. Late, yes, but never too late. If you've stayed with this story until now, perhaps a quiet part of you has begun to stir again. Feel free to leave a like to hold on to that feeling. Leave a comment if your heart fluttered somewhere in this story. And follow the channel so you don't miss more love stories, subtle, quiet, and just enough to make you believe that loving again is always possible, at any age, after any loss. Because the heart, if it still beats, still has a rhythm left for love.